What I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about, combined experience, building and running, SRE, and that's why I call it cybersecurity. It might be like a, very generic term, both from, previous experience as well as, running at Google, which is, not the same thing as you will see. First, a little bit of context in terms of size, and that's probably, one of the major differences, operating in, either in an enterprise or software vendor, house, and at Google, the sheer scale, of the environment. Some of the public numbers you've seen us, talk about is the amount of code we run. It's been 2 billion plus for quite some time now. And then what my team does, and I just picked, one example, when it comes to DDoS mitigation. So that number comes from a public blog. I think we published August last year, and I've been in the DDoS space for a long time. My career was in telco. I spent 17 years in telco, so dealing with DDoS, was my, kind of day job at some point. And this is not what you expect. Okay, that's a good one. In 25 minutes. Okay, well, I guess I will have to do it now because actually this runs in. Let me just do it quickly. Wow, that's a good one. So I had a lot of things do it to me, right? But this one is a good one. Thank you. That's a very good one. It's coming back up. Oh yeah, exactly. Like, hey, security updates, being pushed, and and me not paying attention this morning, on the update, logo on the side, right? It's coming back up for a second. So, while this comes back up, I can keep talking. So, last year, when we published this blog, we looked, at blocking a DDoS attack that was 47 million, requests per second, which is, really massive. It's coming back up here. I'll be back in a second, and you'll see why. I'll keep talking about this one. Come on, please, pretty please. Yes, here we go. See if the magic works. Yeah, it's the AV team switching. Get this thing back. Perfect, thank you. So, a little bit of entertainment in the morning. Who doesn't like this? Like, it's not even a demo effect, right? It's just like, I failed to look at the icon this morning. So we blocked, 47 requests, a year, virtually like a year ago. Right, and it's something that you need to be prepared for, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a second. Yesterday, just yesterday, we published a blog. There was actually like an industry-wide, coalition looking at mitigating, some new vulnerability in HTTP2. We blocked an attack which was nearly 400 million packets a second, not too long ago, right? So basically, the cat and mouse game, is still happening, right? And being ready, being prepared, having an SRE team looking into security, cybersecurity, disaster resilience, and so on, is super critical in any organization. So that was kind of, part of the message. Before we go in, the other thing that I found really interesting is, the kind of the spread of things the security teams usually have to look at. We, on one hand side, are in charge of making sure that the low-level security infrastructure that powers, Google, think, for example, of IAM, key management, things that are very low in the stack, but also the Google customer-facing security products, right? Think of, reCAPTCHA, safe browsing, some of the tools, you might use day in, day out, or some of the products you might consume from the cloud security stack. This thing is really interesting because, it's very far away, but at the same time, it's very close. So how do you leverage, an SRE team in the cybersecurity space to look at, both those things? One which is very internal-facing, one which is customer-facing. And you'll see why I keep, mentioning the customer-facing side, because, when SRE started, SRE was a very internal function in many organizations, and what I see now is SRE becoming a much more external-facing role. So basically, a little bit, you will see that, the SRE kind of role and impact and interfaces are evolving over time. The other thing, that SRE does, because there's a lot of research going on, you're looking into reducing toil, doing more automation, so on. But then the security space, you have to understand where the attacker is going to go next, right? So this is something that most people in the security teams look after. Think of it like, is it threat intelligence? Understanding the adversaries, but also like what's happening, from a let's say, geopolitical environment, right? Many of you work in companies that operate globally. There are always things happening, and it can be climate change, right? When data centers run hot, how to respond to a hot running data center, and how do you move workloads? There's many, many things that are happening where, I see many leaders in organizations, look at the SRE teams to either own this in terms of risk, or actually at least have an opinion on it and consult. Again, showing the value of what SRE provides, to a different set of stakeholders and customers internally. I'm going to talk about, some of the cybersecurity SRE culture at Google. Some of the things, I guess we have many, many SREs in the room. It's something that's probably your day in, day out. You'll be like, yeah, Nico, we know all this. That's fine. I'm trying to connect this also to the work, that's happening, in similar roles in, non-SRE teams. Think of like a SOC, like a security operations center. And then the last part is trying to connect some of this work and some of the thoughts, some of those ideas to the enterprise model, right? Because, hyperscalers and enterprise, whatever the enterprise is, probably don't operate the same way, but there's really bridges we can create and lessons we can learn from each other, in both directions. So where do I start? I think even yesterday, one of the first, keynote, I think actually the first keynote yesterday talked about eBPF, observability, telemetry, visibility. That's where security starts. Right? I've been in the security space for a very long time. If you don't know and you cannot see what is going on, you're dead. You're basically blind. You don't know. It's very difficult. And visibility starts with asset management, right? And in many enterprises, I've been talking to a lot of customers in past life. Asset management is very, very hard. Either you have the tools, or you don't. And when you have the tools, usually they don't align. Your antivirus might report, that many systems. Your endpoint management system is going to report that many systems. Or your IT team might only look at the server side of things. So getting a holistic view of assets in an organization is foundational. And then being able to observe what's going on is very, very key, right? So really having a view from asset management, a good monitoring visibility platform, where you can feed elements into it, events and also on, and actually make sense of the data, in there is super important, right? And people also have been, using, ML models, to make more sense of that data, using LLM models to summarize, events that are coming up. So you can see also how the AI, or the ML world is starting to influence some of the tools, we've been either building or using in SRE. The other thing, which we keep saying in security as well, and in SRE, is training and more training. Right? Most of you spend a lot of time, training and onboarding new SREs, when they join your organizations, and keep repeating that. Not losing the muscle memory. Either you're being on call, you're being on shift, you're dealing, with escalations. I think exercising, first of all, having, playbooks to respond. Either like written playbooks, automated playbooks is super important. In the security space, what we see lately is having, automated playbooks helps a lot, right? It avoids mistake, it avoids, fat fingering, as we love to call it, things and then, impacting systems. So having this in place is super, super important. And I think, many of you in the SRE community, follow this kind of, blameless policy approach to looking at events, right? People make mistakes, systems are complicated, you never have the full picture, and also this kind of no heroes approach. And I think that is one that really didn't exist in the security space for a long time, right? And I think bring that together, so bring together the SRE culture and, what comes out of maybe the security world, is actually a very interesting piece. And then the last one, which we start to see a lot more, especially recently, I say recently now, it's been a few years, especially in the enterprise space, like people realize that having backups is one thing, but being able to restore is another thing, right? And there's still, especially when it comes to security attacks, things like, people that get compromised by malware, when they get cryptojacked, and things like that. People are like, oh, I got a backup. Oh, but my backup also got encrypted. How do I resolve this, right? Or have a backup that's going to take me 1 week to restore, right? Because the way things are being backed up and things like that. So, basically going into this, just don't look at live systems and, think that things will run once they kind of turned up, but also like, look into, hey, what if I have to cold start? I think, many organizations now in the last year or two have started to look like, okay, things might be running now, but what if I have to cold start again, right? So something to keep in mind. And basically, do you have a good turn-up workflow, right? Because this is something people don't exercise a lot, which I see becoming, much more top of mind lately. we all know in SRE, and I think this is the type of metrics I guess many of you use. But just looking at the work the teams are doing, this combination of engineering work, projects, and then dealing with interrupts and on-call, right? And usually we're all looking at a good ratio where people shouldn't be spending more than 20% on operational tasks. Try to get 50% on project work, which is quite important, and then the rest is kind of a buffer that you use to absorb, research, growing, training, and things like that. And assessing that is super important, right? And it's true in the SRE world, but also when I joined Google, I was like, hang on, this makes a lot of sense. And isn't it exactly what many people have been struggling with in security operations centers? Right, you have a lot of SOC analysts that have to look at a lot of events, that have to build tools to deal with it, that are on call, that need to escalate, and you get this page of fatigue as well. You say the same incidents, and you don't really see the need from the haystack anymore. So I think having something like that is super important. And then the second part, which we also see a lot in SRE world, in the SOC world, is give people things to work on beyond looking at alerts, beyond investigating incidents, beyond looking at threat intelligence, right? Usually this is what keeps them, really interested in the work, right? So finding that balance between, looking at events, threat incidents, and so on, but also having programs and projects to work on to maybe make the system better, is actually super important. So really having something like that in place is really part, I think, of any culture. Most SRE teams do that, the ones I've been talking to. I think it's something that we should be bridging, into the security teams, especially when you look at, SOCs and MSSPs that operate SOCs. Then again, SLOs and postmortems is something that is part of, the SRE culture from the get-go. It's been quite interesting to look at how do you expand SLOs, service level objectives, and translate those into something that makes sense in the security world, right? It's not just about availability, QPS, uptime, what's your error budget, and so on. Because in security, an error budget might not be acceptable, right? Because either you have a security incident or you don't, right? And the outcomes might be very different. So, it's been an interesting journey to see, in the security world, how do you look at system availability, which is still very critical, or service availability or API availability, but also how do you define an SLO and SLIs that actually match some type of security events and how you use them as escalation points. So that's an interesting combination that you need to look at when you're building such a team, and basically expanding your SLO monitoring with more kind of a security-focused type of performance management. And then the other thing is combining what SRE do very well, this system-wide thinking, having this end-to-end understanding of systems and services. Most of your dev teams or products are very vertical, right? They have a very deep vertical understanding of their product and the service. SREs usually bring that system thinking, end-to-end thinking. How do you add the threat management, threat posture, threat analysis on top of that? Right, because it's not something you look at by default, right? So again, combining the knowledge you have on the system side with the security knowledge being it, in the stack itself, at the application level or somewhere else is very, very critical. So something that's really interesting to bring in. And I think, the three other, bullet points you see at the bottom, this is, again, very common, in the SRE practice. Again, how do you expand that to look at security things? Think of, vulnerability management, patching of systems, scanning, some of the testing, is a kind of, white box testing or, this type of things. How do you expand that to include what you get from the security tools, from the security teams? And also, how do you start to partner with, orange and red teams? Basically, looking the same way SREs try to break services to make sure they're more reliable. How do you partner with the security teams that are maybe sitting outside of your organization, maybe under a CIO or CISO, to actually inject their findings into your postmortems, into AIs and bugs that you track to make systems more secure? I think that partnership, is also kind of new and is still building, in recent years. And that's kind of a little bit, what this slide here shows. It all started, kind of virtually, I guess, 20 or so years ago with, reliability engineering. And then quickly, security and velocity, became part of the mix. And, it was always a balance, especially, there's only some, like most organizations, they don't only so many resources, right? So you have to pick your battles, right? You have to prioritize, and you have to find a balance, right? Between, feature velocity, service availability, the security of the environment. And for very long, security was always, could have been very binary for a very long time, and then we entered in a space where it was turning more into risk management and understanding risk and having mitigations in place. So that also was, to me, the first evolution of the practice. And I think a lot of organizations codified some of this into production principles. What are some of the baselines you're expecting from your production or your systems from production environments? Where we are now is, I think, on the right-hand side. It keeps expanding. So the remit of SRE, is really, spreading, which I find is great because it's giving, our teams a lot of career opportunities. The two things that we're really looking into now as well is resilience. Think of the business continuity, the low probability, high consequence events. How do you turn up from cold start again and things like that, which are very important, and then efficiency. Right, because it's not just about carbon footprint and the cost of electricity and things like that, but we all want to make sure we have a more efficient use of the resources available to us to also be able to add new things into the system. So I'm not going to talk too much about efficiency, but you're going to see me talk much more about resilience and that journey from reliability to security to being very inclusive of resilience as part of the SRE core function. The big question that always comes is, what is the cost to implement, right? For a very long time, and I've been in security for probably 25 years now, there's always this conversation about, budgets. How do you sell your security outcomes to your leadership team, right? Getting the budget, not just being an OPEX line on a P&L sheet, right? So proving kind of, past value delivered and future value or future protection, some people just see it as insurance, is very important. So it is important in most organizations at large scale, the cost to implement and the time it takes to implement, is very, very important. So having that understanding and, when you engage, that's also like, I think a radical change, maybe not a radical change, that might be a strong word, but, SREs, being more exposed to internal senior leadership, selling, their roadmaps and their needs into the teams and not just being like an operational team, which are, sometimes the view leadership has of SRE, is super important, right? So I think, you should leverage, your skills, what you know, and where you're going in terms of SRE teams to actually be part of business conversations in organizations. But you need to understand the cost of doing things. The other thing that's happening, and you will sometimes in organizations see the leadership team connecting to you as an SRE team, because the number, I think, in most industries of regulations and compliance demands or certifications is growing, right? And who has usually the answers when it comes to technical topics? Either engineering, the dev teams, or the SRE teams, right? So, quite often nowadays, you will see leadership, being it your CIO, your CISO, your chief risk officer, or even your chief, a legal officer, reach out to you as an SRE lead to get input and views on security controls, like, if you need to actually have, FedRAMP to pick one, right? So, because some of those things are not just like, one moment in time type certifications, there's actually a need to understand how your controls are applied in production and how do you report back to regulators. So that connection, becomes two-way, not just you engaging, with the leadership team about security topics or production topics, but also the other way around, they coming to you asking for help. The other thing which is, quite important as an SRE team, especially if you're in a leadership position, especially in large organizations, usually you have a number of, depending, like could be a holding setup, could be like different BUs, aka, business units. There might be a global CISO, chief, information security officer. There might be, split. They might be functional. So it's really important to understand, how you interface with those leaders and how you're able to influence them. Right. Again, as part of the evolution of the SRE practice, especially in the leadership positions, like, it is very important to start to engage with them, work with them, and work together on achieving company goals, right? Because, sometimes you have to rely on them for implementation, sometimes they have to rely on you, and getting buy-in from those, various kind of leaders in those part of the BUs who have maybe different, business goals than you is actually very important. The last thing, which I think is very important, is products is an internal aim for the way we look at production and operational excellence over time. So are our teams well structured? Is the organizational health there, the team health, the OKRs? If you remember that slide, but also we see a pivot in that space to include security production principles. Right? For a very long time, we've been looking at teams, we've been looking at SLOs, we've been looking at what does it take to back up, restore, think of data integrity. And what you see happening now is real integration of some of the security production principles into those measurements, because it's important to understand what kind of risk are teams carrying and how are those risks being mitigated over time. So this is something which I find quite interesting. It's still nascent, but I think it's an important pivot because, again, those metrics at some point are going to become part of conversations you're going to have with your leadership. Can be your C-level, can be your board, could be regulators. So having that connection, end to end, and be able to explain to the SRE teams the why they are working on this and why this is important is actually something that I find fascinating, and it's again a good way to foster the adoption of the SRE approach into organizations. The last, or one of the last parts, which I find interesting, is the reliability piece. So we talked about where is SRE coming from, what does SRE do in the cybersecurity space, why are we expanding it to address more of the security domain than we did previously. The other thing is kind of the more forward-looking piece. Many SRE teams, engage in research. They are forward-looking. They are exploring, what's going to happen out there. And we have a team, and I've seen that in many organizations, especially when they partner with a security team, is not just looking at making the production environment more secure, but also looking into what we call low probability, high consequence events. Like things that might not happen, or the likelihood to happen is actually very low, but if it does, how do you respond? Like, back in, you go back 4 or 5 years, it was always like, yeah, we'll never be hit by a piece of malware that's going to encrypt, all the IT systems. It's only happening to others, right? But when it happens, like, how do you respond, right? So those type of things, in the enterprise, or like I said, more kind of planet-wide changes happening at geopolitical level. So it's really important, as I said, to be able to also not just partner with the security team, but also starting to partner with the disaster resilience teams. So SRE has a lot of experience. You all have a lot of experience in what it takes to run systems in production. Usually your playbooks, your workflows, and so on what needs to be done in case something happens. Quite often, you do tabletop type exercises, wheel of misfortune, whatever they call, inside the organization. And keep doing those is actually super important, but also injecting what's coming out of them into the teams that are looking at more global, company resilience. And there can be many things, like I said, there can be things we already know of, but also macro risks that might be coming up. Climate change, is affecting data centers, for example. There's tensions in some regions, war in others, right? All those things might impact, the way you operate. And being prepared for it is super important. So researching this, again, providing the consulting value of you knowing how to operate and make the best of it is actually super important. Like I said, partnering with red teams that do kind of pen test, penetration testing, and so on is also very important, because there can be lessons learned both ways, and having adversarial approaches to protecting production is actually very important as well. The other piece is trying to balance, having global policies and applying them locally, right? In many large organizations, if you go back also to the examples of having an organization with many business units, there's probably going to be a company-wide mandate or policy, but then, making sure that you can apply it locally and make sense locally, to also maybe, reduce the blast radius of an event in a production environment is actually very important. And again, there the value of SRE is very, very critical. So, being able to make sense of those policies, adjust them, provide, again, guidance back to the leadership, is something very important. And then there's always those, I picked this, Schrodinger's cats, as kind of like a joke, right? in the security space, there's always things that are very complicated because like the Venn diagram doesn't really intersect, right? And you have to make it intersect. And I'll tell you why. You know, the example here is the K in here is for key management, right? You know, many of you use encryption, you know, in many places, you know, for data at rest, data in transit, you know, authentication and so on. So really, you know, it's very important, right? You are probably like, you have offline copies of the keys if you have to cold start and things like that again. So the problem with keys is like, that's what attackers usually are after, right? Because that's the key to the kingdom, right? How do you find the right balance between making sure that keys or key material is available everywhere, it needs to be available in real time, right? Because, you know, it's being used a lot in, you know, compute to around any piece of data, and at the same time, making sure it's very, very secure, which means you don't want to expose it very much, right? So, and that's where SRE teams come in, right? Finding, you know, those three pieces, creating an intersection to make sure that, you know, key material is at the same time safe and protected and available and highly available, you know, is one of those challenges, right? And that's where, you know, I think a lot of the value of SRE in the cybersecurity space comes is like finding ways to make things that maybe don't intersect on paper actually intersect. That's the, I think that's the magic, you know, of SRE in some cases. And honestly, like even after 2 years, I'm still fascinated by some of those things because those are really hard problems to solve. And then the last piece I already touched on, to me, is disaster resilience. It's something that, you know, I don't think is part of the SRE, you know, practice yet. I think we're getting there. And I think it is, as I said, really important, going from that journey from security to risk to actually you know, doing disaster resilience. It is natural evolution to me, and you might find this kind of funny, right? You know, we define kind of 3 states. So this is kind of an example. You can copy that example if you like, right? You know, might not apply to you, but we've defined kind of, you know, 3 modes of operations, right? Normal, which is incidents are happening, which is, you know, and, you know, in a large environment, there's always incidents. So the normal state is having incidents, you know, which might not be the normal state in your organization. Disaster mode is already something has happened, but the blast radius of the impact is limited to a set of services, to a region, for example, or emergency mode. Emergency mode is like something is hard down, we might have to turn up, you know, from cold start again, right? And the question is, how are you able to navigate, you know, each of those? Do you have systems, architectures, processes, workflows in place to address all of that? Usually the green part, the normal mode, handling incidents, this is well known. You know, this is like day job. You do that day in, day out, eyes closed, without coffee in the morning, not a problem. You know, disaster mode, usually most SRE teams, they have a nice escalation process, they have IRC, they have chats, they get together, they get into the war rooms. You know, they know how to recover, there's playbooks for that. I don't see too many SRE teams having the emergency capability yet. And it's something that you might not need, but again, low probability, high consequence, maybe you will need it. So something to explore is like, how do you recover from a real hard failure where you might not have maybe local hands, right? You're only remote, right? How do you do this? Like, you know, you have to cold start an environment completely again. So there's a lot of things there to think of. So my message to you here, you know, today, if there's maybe, you know, one thing to remember from, you know, this talk, except the Chrome reboot, you know, is, you know, just, you know, build on your normal plus disaster, you know, playbooks and workflows and processes, but also look into emergency mode, because there's going to be more going forward of those, and exercise them. You know, I mentioned, you know, tabletop, wheels of misfortune, you know, partnering with other teams, you know, it is very important. You know, this is where also, like, you know, might be a joke, like, you know, oh, SRE connects to the real world. You know, you might have to partner with, you know, teams on the ground to do things physically for you, repatch systems, reboot physically, you know, move things, right, move teams, you know, do things. So, you know, having those exercises, you know, and running them and having plans, you know, is important. And just don't run them once, you know, come up with a process where maybe as part of turn-up, you try it, you know, before you go live with the system. So at least, you know, you have a, you know, a good environment to test with. And then once it's live, maybe define a set of tiers, right, where depending on the potential impact of your tabletop exercises, you either let the team run it every month, or maybe you do it, you know, every half year, and you just, you know, make sure that everybody knows this is happening, and you have a way to respond. I think, you know, this is very critical. And, you know, being prepared, you know, remains key. It remains key because, there's so much going on usually. I mean, usually the cognitive load many SREs have is pretty large, right? So making sure that thing is documented, is up to date. I always remember this joke of documentation is like bananas. It's always too green or too ripe, right? So how do you make sure that, documentation you have, the playbooks you have, the muscle memory you have of this is actually being maintained, and this is quite important. And you might want to do this across the stack. I mean, this, I looked at it through the lens of security in this talk, but it's something you can actually expand, to many of the SRE functions and many of the systems and services and products you touch. How does make this for you? I think we always say don't try to mirror, what we do because of the sheer scale sometimes. And this is something I've kind of suffered from, in past life. When I was working for a telco, like, 10 years ago, every time Google was publishing something new about networking, think of the days of software-defined networking, my CEO was on my back like, hey, Nico, why do we still use BGP when we could use this, PC stuff from Google, right? So, it's important to learn, in both directions, from, the way, we operate and also from the way you operate. And, having, a good idea on how to maybe translate some of the practices both ways. The other thing, which is true at hyperscalers, and also very true in many enterprise environments is, the build versus buy. SREs for a very long time, have built their own tools. Many of us, I mean, I'm a geek, I was like, came out of the sysadmin, network engineering world. So, back in the days, we're all building our own tools, right? Because we knew better, right? And then at some point, we move on. Nobody's here to maintain them. They don't scale, right? So I think trying to find the right combo, what I'm trying to say here, try to find the right combination between, what you want to build yourself and maintain yourself and make scale, things you might want to buy as commercial off-the-shelf products that you want to adjust. I mean, commercial off-the-shelf, and or SaaS products. And how does that make sense in the context of platforms? I think the other thing I'm seeing, from talking to many SRE teams, in different companies is they have the same problem, right? Because the SRE practice started somewhere, grew, right? And there's a lot of, we have built this, ourselves to now like, hey, there's some products out there that do this for us that we could actually adopt and adjust. How do you bring those in, but also at the same time don't create more fragmentation, right? Because having been in the cybersecurity software space for a long time, most chief information security officers, they've suffered from that fragmentation. Like, too many point products that don't talk to each other. If you think back about my visibility and asset management, you take 5 tools and you ask them the asset management question, you get 5 different answers, if not 6. So, rethink, now, I mean, it's probably planning season for many of you for 2024, right? Maybe rethink, the tooling you have today, the workflows, and is there a way to do like a platform pivot? I know the platform pivot is something people have been mentioning for a very long time in all the industries, but it's something to always keep in mind. So also rethinking like, your software stack going forward. And then the last one, which I find also very interesting, is finding the right combo between DevOps, SRE, and a combination of that. And even bringing kind of CloudOps in the mix, so depending, I mean, I think we all have our definitions of what SRE, DevOps, CloudOps is, but I think, I don't think there's a one size fits all, right? I've seen everything work from like pure DevOps to, pure SRE teams to having, CloudOps in the mix. And also nowadays, what we see a lot in many enterprises is a combination of DevOps plus SRE, where the SRE team is, sometimes more hyper-specialized. And again, we see this, in the security space a lot, right? Because for a very long time, the concentration of security skills, was very limited in organizations. But that doesn't mean that, you shouldn't be rethinking also your organizational design, when it comes to building those teams, right? Because I think the skills needed are changing, the way you operate are changing. There's a shift left to the dev side, in some of the things. So, the message here is like, don't be static, right? The world is evolving around us. Like, how do we adjust to this? And like I said earlier, I really like to look at this combination of the system-wide thinking intersecting with the vertical expertise, right, and evolving that over time. So that's some of the lessons learned, for somebody who's been at Google for 2 years, who came from a very different non-SRE background. And I hope this was useful, as a, first, what is it, like Wednesday morning presentation. Last one before taking questions. There's a couple of books, that you probably know of them. There's the, the SRE book, but there's also the Building Secure and Reliable Systems book, which is also, available for free. You can actually read it online. It's it's quite interesting to see how you can, build on the SRE foundation and then expanding it to, building secure and reliable systems. It's very worth a read. You don't have to read all the chapters, it's pretty large, but skimming over it, is always like a good piece of advice. With that, thank you very much for listening.